G'day gamers, Aussie Wargamer here in Moree, Australia, and welcome to my channel. On this episode, I'll be helping out Terminal Spleen, who asked on Facebook how an old fantasy player can make the transition to Age of Sigmar. I'm going to break this down into 4 sections. Firstly, talking about the Age of Sigmar lore and how it's different to Warhammer Fantasy battles. I'll talk about rules and war scrolls, about army composition, and I'll talk about the change from square to round bases. So let's get to it, eh? So the reason we're having this conversation to begin with is because back in 2015, Games Workshop decided to relaunch Warhammer Fantasy Battles as an entirely new game in essentially an entirely new setting called Warhammer Age of Sigmar. We've seen an influx of old fantasy players getting into the game since the release of 2nd edition of Age of Sigmar last year, which is really exciting. If you're one of those people, I hope you have a cracker of a time with the game. The story goes that the old world was destroyed primarily by Archaon, and Sigmar was left clinging to the core of the world, where he floated around in the void for a bit. Unbeknownst to the God King, the destruction of the world that was released a bunch of magical energy that formed 8 planes of existence, known as the mortal realms. Each realm took on the aspect of one of the winds of magic: fire in Akshi, metal in Shamon, shadow in Ulgu, light in Haish, life in Gairan, death in Shaish, beasts in Gur, and heaven in Azir. As Sigmar was bobbing around in the great void, a giant star drake named Dracothian revealed the mortal realms to him. Sigmar set about exploring the realms and found out that others had survived the ending of the old world as well. Some were gods themselves, such as Archaon, Nagash, Gorkamorka, and Grimnir. Some were rescued by gods or through arcane means. Others were memories and spirits that began to take physical form. Other survivors of the end times fought their way out of the realm of chaos, or hid in a mirror dimension, or some other worldly haven. Some, like the Slan, travelled through the stars to be guided into the mortal realms by Dracothian as well. The realms are giant enclosed spheres, but are connected by realm gates, magical portals between realms. There are 3 main eras in the history of the mortal realms. There's the Age of Myth, where Sigmar and the other gods established colonies, built cities, and fought giant monsters. After thousands of years of trying, the Chaos gods broke into the mortal realms to begin the Age of Chaos, where they basically stomped on the proverbial sandcastles everyone else had set up. Sigmar buggered off to the realm of heaven and closed the door with his tail between his legs. After centuries of chaos having their way with the realms, Sigmar decided to do something about it, grabbed the souls of a bunch of mighty warriors as they were about to die, and together with the dwarven smith god Grungni, reforged them into Stormcast Eternals and waged war on chaos once again. This started the current era called the Age of Sigmar. For a more detailed look at the story, you can jump on YouTube and check out 2Plus Tough, who has done some great videos going through the story. Link in the description below. So not only has the setting of the game changed, there's been lots of changes to the mechanics of the game. But probably the most positive is that Games Workshop offer the rules of the game for free. I've linked the core rules in the description below. For Age of Sigmar, G-Dubs have streamlined the basic rules of the game, which cover the mechanics of moving, shooting, charging, fighting, using magic and command abilities, as well as rules for terrain. The real depth of the game comes from War Scrolls. War Scrolls provide the stat lines and abilities for every unit that is playable in the game. And again, G-Dubs provides them free of charge. The best way to access them is through the Age of Sigmar app, links below, but you can simply Google search them and they'll come up. There are 2 ways to get points for your models. If you want to continue down the road as cheap as free, Games Workshop's War Scroll Builder is a great free resource to put your armies together. The more thorough way, though, is the General's Handbook, a yearly publication that provides battle plans, allegiances, and points for all the supported units in the game. You'll have to shell out some clams for that one. Once you get deeper into the game, you'll probably want to shell out some more clams to grab a few books that expand the rule set and give you more options in the game. The core rulebook is a great start, as it's a beautiful book packed with a ton of awesome stuff such as lore, army breakdowns, battle plans, Grand Alliance abilities, and rules for playing in the realms. You'll also want to pick up Malign Sorcery if you want access to endless spells and realm-specific artifacts and spells. Games Workshop have also been really good at keeping the rules up to date. They release big FAQs a couple of times a year, as well as FAQs a couple of weeks after each new battle tome is released. No longer do we have to wait 4 years for a new edition or a new army book to get updated rules and balance the game out. All that can be found on the community site, linked below. It's also important to note that Age of Sigmar introduced the 3 ways to play system to Games Workshop games. You can either play open play, which is basically do whatever you want with the game, narrative play through campaign systems, custom scenarios and the like, and of course matched play, pitting 2 relatively balanced armies against each other. Well, there have also been a bunch of changes with armies from Fantasy to Age of Sigmar. Firstly, there are 4 main groups of armies called Grand Alliances. They're Order, Chaos, Death, and Destruction. Within those Grand Alliances, you have allegiances or factions. In match play, you can field any unit from one Grand Alliance in your army, but you usually are rewarded for sticking to one allegiance through allegiance abilities. If the army has a battle tome, the allegiance abilities will be in there. But some allegiances have their abilities in the General's Handbook or not at all. So here's a quick rundown of all the 8th edition fantasy armies and where they stand now. Firstly, the Beastmen. These guys are now Beasts of Chaos and had a battle tome come out last year. Bretonia are now sadly unsupported by Games Workshop and will likely stay that way. You can't buy their miniatures, at least not from Games Workshop anyway. They're still playable, and those of you that watch my channel will know that I still play them, but they're underwhelming on the table. Demons of Chaos and Warriors of Chaos have been combined and split into 5 factions. There's the Blades of Khorne, Disciples of Tzeentch, Maggotkin of Nurgle, Hosts of Slaanesh, and Slaves to Darkness. It's still possible to run mixed Chaos armies, but you lose the cool allegiance abilities of the factions if you do. Dark Elves are also split up into sub-factions. There's the Daughters of Cain, the Scourge Privateers, Darkling Covens, and Order Serpentis. Oh, and you spell elves with an A now. Dwarves have been renamed Dwarden, and there are 3 main dwarvish factions. The Dispossessed, which are the dwarves fantasy players will be familiar with. Fire Slayers, which are a faction of red-headed dwarves who don't like pants. And the new faction of Dwarven Sky Pirates, the Caradron Overlords. The Empire are more or less the same, but are now called Free People. High Elves are again split into sub-factions. You have Phoenix Temple, Order Draconis, Lion Rangers, Eldritch Council, and Swifthawk Agents. Lizardmen have been renamed Seraphon, but are otherwise much the same. Ogre Kingdoms are now spelled O-G-O-R-S, and again are split into several factions. Gutbusters are the main faction, but there are some outliers like Maneaters and the Firebelly. There's also a faction of ogres riding mammoths called the Beastclaw Raiders. Orcs and Goblins are again split into factions. Goblins are now Grots or Gits, and they're collected under the banner of Gloomspite Gits. Orcs are now called Oryx and come in 2 main varieties, the Armoured Ironjaws and the Feral Bone Splitters. Skaven were recently collected into 1 battle tome and are more or less unchanged, with a few exceptions to now outdated models. Tomb Kings are like the Bretonians, playable but unsupported. Vampire counts are now 3 main factions. Legions of Nagash, which include your skeletons, vampires, zombies, and some ghosty boys. Nighthaunt are an all-ghost army, and Flesh Eater courts have your ghouls, horrors, and terrorgeists. Finally, Wood Elves are now called Wanderers, and the tree spirits such as Dryads and Tree Lords are called the Sylvaneth. On top of these factions, there are of course the Stormcast Eternals and the Idoneth Deepkin. Most people should be able to just plonk their fantasy army on the table and have it work in Age of Sigmar, but there are models that are no longer part of the game. The best thing to do is to just jump on the app and have a look through the War Scrolls. Reading the War Scrolls will also help you to determine what works the same way as it did in Fantasy or similar ways, and what will work differently in Age of Sigmar. Well, one thing that Terminal Spleen asked me directly about was round bases. While it's perfectly acceptable to play Age of Sigmar on square bases with your mates, the game was designed for round bases, and most tournaments these days require armies to be on rounds. So how do you go about transferring your old square-based army onto round bases? Well, first you'll need bases. I use these 3mm MDF laser cut bases that are available for cheap on eBay. Links in the description. You can also get plastic bases, not as cheap, but still readily available. Again, links below. There are a couple of ways that you can go about the process of rebasing your models. I just got a couple of old skelly legs here on square bases that I found in my bits box. Don't know where they came from, but I found them in my bits box. They'll be perfect for rebasing. So the first method, you'll need your sprue cutters, your clippers. I just got these cheap ones. I do have a good pair, but cheap ones will work for this. Like $2 at Super Cheap Auto or whatever. And you're just going to clip the corners of the base like this and push out those edges, and we're going to clip off the edge of the base. So what we'll be left with is just a square, flat piece of plastic. So just clip them off like this. And what we've got is just a square piece of plastic, no base to it. Okay, now we'll take our blank base. I've got this 3mm MDF round. It's 25 mils. And a bit of modelling putty. This is the yellow-grey Milliput. So the nice cheap stuff is perfect for this. You'd glue the base down. Obviously, I don't have time to do that. But you glue the square onto your round. And then using Milliput, we're just going to blend that gap in. So you're getting a nice gradient from the edge of the base up to the top of the square base. And you're going to do that all the way around the base. Obviously, I won't do that for time, but you get the idea. So we're sculpting just with the cheap clay around the edge of the base. Then you can put your basing texture on, your sand or your kitty litter or whatever it is you use. Obviously you'd be glued on to retexture it up, and you've got your square onto your round. The other way of doing it, of course, is to cut your model off. The base itself. And then re-glue it. Now this can be a little bit tricky. These skeleton legs will be good because they're fairly thin and fairly brittle, so we need to be careful with them. So what I do is I just clear away some of this texture around the model, particularly any bigger bits, just with my knife. And then you need to find a nice place where you can get your knife under the model. So his heel on this connection point will be perfect. You just want to get your knife under the model and then just very slowly, very gently slice across, making sure that you're not cutting up into the model. Slice across until that contact point is released. We'll clear some texture on this side, get it under the heel. Just take your time with it. Sometimes they'll come easily, sometimes they're a little bit more work. And then you should be able to have your model off the base. I've put a link to Games Workshop's official base chart in the description below. You'll note it doesn't include base sizes for compendium models, that is, that models G-dubs don't sell anymore. The size chart is at the end of the errata document, so you have to scroll to the bottom to get there. So to sum up, you can get started in the game for free using the core rules, War Scrolls, and War Scroll Builder, and your square-based models to get started as well. Once you get into the game though, you'll want to shell out some money for the core rulebook, the General's Handbook, and Malign Sorcery, as well as undergoing your rebasing project. Well, that's all from me. I hope that was helpful to some people. Let me know if you have any questions or if you have any other advice to old fantasy players in the description below. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay tuned if you want to hear more of my voice. Catch yous later.